I watched through my security camera feed as 3 HOA board members stood on my lawn at 2 in the morning, and what they were doing made my blood run cold. Let me back up. My name is Aaron Oakes, and I live in Willow Creek Estates, a planned community in Scottsdale, Arizona. I bought my house 3 years ago, a nice 4-bedroom ranch style with a decent backyard and a view of the McDowell Mountains. The HOA seemed reasonable at first. Monthly dues were $200, the neighborhood was clean, and nobody bothered me much. That changed 6 months ago when Patricia Hendricks became the HOA president. Patricia was everything you would expect from a nightmare HOA president. She was 52, drove a white Mercedes SUV, and had that distinctive haircut that screamed she wanted to speak to the manager. Within her first month, she sent violation notices to half the neighborhood for the most ridiculous things. My first notice came because my mailbox was apparently the wrong shade of black. According to her, it needed to be coal black, not midnight black. I had to pull out paint swatches to prove they were the same color. The second notice came because my grass was half an inch too tall. I measured it myself. It was 3.5 inches. The HOA covenant said grass should not exceed 4 inches. I took photos with a ruler and appealed. Patricia denied the appeal, claiming her measurements were more accurate than mine. I had to pay a $75 fine, but the real problem started in September. I had been having issues with drainage in my backyard. Every time it rained, water would pool near my back fence. Arizona does not get much rain, but when it does, it comes down hard. I hired a landscaping company to assess the problem. They told me the grade was wrong and water was actually flowing from the common area behind my property onto my land. The common area was HOA responsibility. I submitted a formal complaint to the HOA on September 15th. I included photos, a report from the landscaping company, and a detailed explanation. I asked them to fix the drainage issue in the common area. 2 weeks later, I got a response. Patricia claimed there was no drainage problem in the common area. She said the issue was with my property, and I needed to fix it myself. She also threatened to fine me if standing water remained on my property for more than 48 hours after rainfall, calling it a mosquito hazard. I could not believe it. I sent another letter with more documentation. I even had the landscaping company write a formal letter explaining that the problem originated from HOA property. Patricia responded by saying the board had investigated and found no issues. She gave me 30 days to resolve the drainage on my property or face daily fines of $100. That was when I installed security cameras. I put up 4 high-definition cameras with night vision covering my front yard, driveway, both sides of my house, and my backyard. They fed into a system that stored footage on a local hard drive and backed up to cloud storage. I had dealt with enough of Patricia's nonsense that I wanted documentation of everything happening on my property. The cameras went live on October 8th. 2 days later, we got a massive rainstorm. Monsoon season was technically over, but Arizona weather does not always follow the rules. 3 inches of rain fell in 4 hours. I watched from my back window as water poured from the common area onto my property, creating a pond near my fence. I recorded video on my phone as well, showing exactly where the water was coming from. The next morning, I reviewed my security footage. The cameras had captured everything in perfect detail. Water was clearly flowing from the elevated common area down onto my property. The drainage system back there was completely clogged with debris. I compiled the footage, added timestamps, and sent it to the HOA board along with another formal complaint. Patricia's response came 3 days later. She claimed the footage was inconclusive and could have been manipulated. She said the board stood by their assessment that my property was the source of the drainage problem. She also informed me that I now had 15 days to fix the issue before fines started. Oh, and she included an additional violation notice because one of my security cameras was visible from the street, which apparently violated the aesthetic standards of the community. I was furious. I consulted with a real estate attorney named David Chen. He reviewed all my documentation and told me I had a solid case. He drafted a formal letter to the HOA explaining that they were responsible for the drainage issue and that failure to address it could result in legal action. He also pointed out that their threat to fine me for a problem they caused was likely unenforceable. The letter went out on October 20th. I thought maybe, finally, they would take this seriously. Instead, things got worse. On October 23rd, I came home from work to find my back fence damaged. 3 fence posts were snapped off at ground level, and about 15 feet of fence was leaning at a 45-degree angle. The damage was clearly fresh. The wood was splintered, and there were tire tracks in the mud near the fence line. I immediately checked my security cameras. The footage showed everything. At 1:15 p.m., an HOA maintenance truck had driven into the common area behind my property. 2 men got out and started working on the drainage ditch. That part was good news. Finally, they were addressing the problem. But then things went sideways. One of the workers was operating a small backhoe. As he was backing up, he swung the rear end of the machine around and it collided directly with my fence. The impact snapped the posts and knocked the fence over. Both workers got out and looked at the damage. They talked for a minute, then one of them made a phone call. After the call, they both got back in the truck and drove away. They did not leave a note, did not knock on my door, nothing. They just left. I saved the footage and called the HOA office immediately. I spoke with Denise, the property manager. I explained what happened and told her I had video evidence. She said she would look into it and get back to me. I also called my insurance company to report the damage and start a claim. 2 days went by with no response from the HOA. I called again. Denise said she had passed the information to Patricia and the board was discussing it. Another 3 days passed. I sent an email with a clip of the security footage attached, showing the exact moment of impact. I got an auto reply saying Patricia was out of the office. On November 1st, I finally received a formal response. I could not believe what I was reading. The letter, signed by Patricia, stated that the HOA had investigated my claim and determined they were not responsible for the fence damage. According to her, the fence was old and poorly maintained and had likely fallen due to the recent rain and wind. She noted that maintaining fences was the homeowner's responsibility per the CC and Articus. She also reminded me that I needed to repair the fence within 30 days to comply with community standards. I was beyond angry. I had clear video evidence of their maintenance crew destroying my fence. I forwarded everything to David Chen. He watched the footage and shook his head. He said this was one of the most clear-cut cases of negligence and liability denial he had seen. He sent another letter to the HOA, this time explicitly threatening legal action. He included screenshots from the security footage showing the backhoe hitting the fence. The response came from the HOA's attorney, a woman named Sandra Murphy. Her letter was infuriating. She claimed that upon further review, the footage was unclear and did not definitively show HOA equipment damaging the fence. She argued that the angle of the camera and the quality of the footage made it impossible to determine exactly what happened. She maintained that the HOA was not liable and would not be paying for repairs. I could not understand how anyone could watch that footage and claim it was unclear. You could see the HOA logo on the truck. You could see the license plate. You could see the backhoe swing around and hit the fence. You could see the fence post snap. It was as clear as day. David advised me that we would likely need to file a lawsuit. He estimated it would cost between $5,000 and $10,000 in legal fees and would take 6 to 12 months to resolve. I did not have that kind of money readily available, and the idea of spending a year fighting these people made me sick. But I also was not going to let them get away with this. Meanwhile, my fence was still damaged. My homeowner's insurance agreed to cover the repairs minus my deductible, but they wanted to subrogate against the HOA to recover their costs. The fence company came out and gave me an estimate of $3,200 for repairs. With my $1,000 deductible, I was out of pocket immediately. I approved the repairs, and they were completed on November 18th. I sent the HOA a final demand letter requesting reimbursement of my deductible plus compensation for my time and stress. I gave them 10 days to respond before filing suit. I did not expect them to pay, but David said we needed to exhaust all reasonable attempts at resolution first. During all this, I kept getting regular HOA violation notices. Patricia was on a crusade. My trash can was visible from the street for more than 12 hours after collection. $50 fine. I had a small oil stain on my driveway. $100 fine for not maintaining my property. A package was left on my porch for 2 days while I was traveling for work. $75 fine for visual clutter. I appealed every single one and won about half. The ones I lost, I paid while documenting everything for what I was sure would become a harassment lawsuit. Other neighbors were experiencing the same thing. I talked to my neighbor to the left, Marcus, who had received 8 violation notices in 2 months. My neighbor to the right, an elderly woman named Helen, was being fined because her son's car was parked in her driveway for more than 72 hours while he visited for Thanksgiving. The 10-day deadline for my demand letter came and went. No response from the HOA. David filed a lawsuit on December 2nd in Maricopa County Superior Court. We sued the HOA for negligence, property damage, breach of their maintenance duties, and harassment. We asked for actual damages plus punitive damages and attorney fees. The HOA was served on December 9th. That was when things took a dark turn. On December 12th, at 2:14 a.m., my security cameras picked up movement in my front yard. 3 people approached my house from the street. They were wearing dark clothing and moving carefully. At first, I thought it was a burglary. But as they got closer to the house, I recognized them. It was Patricia Hendricks, along with 2 other HOA board members, Richard Stokes and Karen Pemberton. Richard was the board treasurer, a balding man in his 60s who always wore polo shirts tucked into khakis. Karen was the secretary, 48 years old with bottle blonde hair and a permanent scowl. I was not home. I was in Denver for a work conference and was not due back until December 14th. I was watching the live camera feed on my phone because I had gotten a motion alert. I watched in real time as these 3 people walked onto my property in the middle of the night. Patricia was carrying something. As they got closer to the house, I could see it was a sledgehammer. My heart started pounding. What the hell were they doing? Richard had a crowbar. Karen was carrying what looked like a gas can. I immediately called 911. I told the dispatcher I was out of state, but my security cameras showed 3 people trespassing on my property with weapons and what appeared to be an accelerant. I gave them my address, and said I feared they were going to damage my property or commit arson. The dispatcher said they were sending units immediately. While staying on the line with the dispatcher, I watched my camera feed. Patricia walked up to my front door and raised the sledgehammer. She swung hard and hit my door just below the peephole. The impact was loud enough that the camera's microphone picked it up. She hit it again. The door frame cracked but held. Richard moved to one of my front windows. He used the crowbar to smash the glass. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the quiet night. He cleared away the remaining shards and Karen stepped forward with the gas can. She started pouring gasoline through the broken window into my house. I was screaming at my phone, even though I was watching a recording delay of a few seconds. The dispatcher was trying to calm me down, assuring me that police were en route. I felt completely helpless watching from 1,200 miles away as these people destroyed my property and prepared to burn down my house. Patricia hit my door a third time. The frame splintered and the door swung partially open. She dropped the sledgehammer and started to step inside. That was when I heard sirens on the camera feed. All three of them froze. Red and blue lights reflected off the front of my house. Patricia said something to the other two. They dropped everything and ran toward the street, but the police cars were already there, blocking their path. I watched as officers jumped out with guns drawn, ordering them to the ground. Patricia actually tried to argue with the police. Even from the camera angle and distance, I could see her mouth moving rapidly, her hands gesturing. The officers were not having it. Within 30 seconds, all three of them were face down on my lawn in handcuffs. The whole incident, from when they first appeared on camera to when they were in handcuffs, lasted 7 minutes. The fire department arrived shortly after and went into my house to ventilate and ensure there was no fire hazard from the gasoline. More police cars arrived. Officers began documenting the scene, taking photos, and collecting evidence. A detective called me about 45 minutes later. His name was Detective James Morrison. He explained that they had arrested 3 individuals for criminal trespassing, attempted burglary, attempted arson, and criminal damage. He asked if I knew the suspects. When I told him they were HOA board members and explained the ongoing dispute, I could hear the surprise in his voice. Detective Morrison asked if I had security footage of the incident. I told him I had everything on video, multiple angles with audio. He asked me to email him access to the footage as soon as possible. I sent him a secure link to my cloud storage with all the relevant files. I also sent footage from earlier in the night showing them parking their cars down the street and walking to my house. I caught the first flight back to Scottsdale the next morning. When I got home around noon, there was crime scene tape across my front yard. My door was damaged but had been secured by the police. My front window was boarded up. There was glass everywhere. The smell of gasoline was overwhelming even outside. Detective Morrison met me at my house. He was in his late 40s, with gray hair and a weathered face that suggested he had seen everything. He walked me through what happened and showed me photos they had taken. The sledgehammer, crowbar, and gas can had all been collected as evidence. He said all 3 suspects were in custody and had been charged. I asked what would happen next. He explained that they would be arraigned, probably later that day or the next morning. Given the severity of the charges, especially the attempted arson, he expected they would be held on significant bail. The county attorney would be handling prosecution. He also mentioned that when he interviewed Patricia at the jail, she had made some interesting statements. Apparently, Patricia had told the detective that she was just trying to create evidence that my security cameras were not reliable. She claimed that if they damaged my property and my cameras did not catch them, it would prove the cameras had not caught the fence damage either. When the detective pointed out that the cameras had, in fact, recorded everything, she changed her story. She then claimed they were just going to knock on my door and leave a notice, and things got out of hand. The detective said the other two had lawyered up immediately and were not talking. But Patricia had dug herself a hole with her initial statements. He also said there might be additional charges coming because breaking into someone's house with intent to pour gasoline inside went beyond simple property damage. The county attorney was considering charges of conspiracy and potentially attempted insurance fraud. That last part confused me. Detective Morrison explained that they had found text messages on Patricia's phone. After I filed the lawsuit, she had texted the other board members discussing ways to discredit me. One message specifically mentioned making it look like I had filed a fraudulent insurance claim. The plan, as far as he could piece together, was to damage my house and make it look like I did it myself for insurance money. That would supposedly discredit my lawsuit and my security footage. It was insane. These were supposedly respectable people. Patricia was a real estate agent. Richard owned a car dealership. Karen was a retired teacher, and they had decided that committing multiple felonies was a reasonable response to a civil lawsuit. Over the next few days, more details emerged. All three were arraigned and charged with conspiracy to commit arson, attempted burglary, criminal damage, and criminal trespassing. Patricia's bail was set at $100,000. Richard's was $75,000. Karen's was $50,000. Patricia posted bail after 2 days. The other two stayed in jail for about a week before their families managed to post bond. The HOA held an emergency meeting and removed all three of them from the board. The remaining 2 board members appointed temporary replacements. I received a formal letter from the new board president, a retired engineer named Thomas Wu, apologizing for everything that had happened and offering to settle all outstanding disputes. They agreed to reimburse me for the fence repairs, drop all fines, and pay for the damage to my front door and window. They also offered me $20,000 to resolve the lawsuit. David advised me that we could probably get more if we continued with the lawsuit, but it would take time and there was always risk. The insurance subrogation would proceed regardless. I decided to accept the offer with some modifications. I wanted $50,000, reimbursement for all attorney fees to date, a formal written apology posted in the community newsletter, and my agreement that I would not personally sue the individual board members. They countered at $35,000. We settled at $40,000 plus attorney fees and the apology. The settlement was finalized on January 7th. I received a check on January 15th. The apology appeared in the February newsletter, though it was carefully worded to avoid admitting liability for anything beyond the specific incidents covered by the settlement. The criminal case moved forward. Patricia hired an expensive defense attorney who tried to get the charges reduced. The county attorney was not budging. They had video evidence, they had Patricia's statements, and they had the text messages showing premeditation. In late February, Patricia's attorney indicated she might be willing to plead guilty to reduce charges. Richard and Karen had separate attorneys who were fighting the charges harder. Their lawyers argued that they had been manipulated by Patricia and did not fully understand what they were doing. The text messages contradicted this. Karen had specifically written that they needed to be careful not to be seen and suggested wearing dark clothing. Richard had researched how to disable security cameras and shared articles in the group chat. The preliminary hearing was held in early March. I had to testify about the fence incident, the HOA's denial of responsibility, and the events of December 12th. The defense attorneys tried to make me look vindictive and suggested I had somehow provoked the situation. The prosecutor countered with the security footage, which spoke for itself. The judge found probable cause to proceed to trial on all charges. In mid-April, just as trial was approaching, all three defendants agreed to plea deals. Patricia pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit arson and criminal damage. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 18 months, plus 5 years probation, and ordered to pay restitution to me and to my insurance company. Her real estate license was revoked. Richard pleaded guilty to attempted burglary and criminal damage. He got 2 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 1 year, plus probation and restitution. His reputation in the community was destroyed, and his car dealership suffered significantly. Karen pleaded guilty to criminal damage and conspiracy. She received 18 months in prison with parole possible after 9 months, plus probation and restitution. Her retirement was essentially ruined. All three were also permanently banned from serving on any HOA board in Arizona, and were required to complete anger management and ethical decision-making courses. The civil lawsuit I had filed was resolved by the settlement, but my insurance company's subrogation case continued. They recovered their full payout plus legal fees from the HOA's insurance carrier. The HOA's insurance premiums increased dramatically, which led to an increase in monthly dues for all homeowners. A lot of my neighbors blamed Patricia and the others for the increase, which caused additional social fallout. The whole ordeal had a silver lining. The new HOA board, led by Thomas Wu, implemented major reforms. They revised the enforcement policies to be more reasonable and less punitive. They established a proper appeals process with neutral third-party review. They increased transparency by posting all board meeting minutes online and allowing homeowner comments at every meeting. They also implemented a policy that any property damage potentially caused by HOA maintenance activities would be immediately documented and reported, with a presumption of HOA responsibility unless evidence showed otherwise. My fence was fully repaired and actually looked better than before. My front door and window were replaced and upgraded. The drainage issue in the common area was properly fixed, and I never had flooding problems again. The HOA even reimbursed me for the landscaping assessment I had paid for out of pocket. I became somewhat of a local legend in the neighborhood. People would stop me at the mailbox to tell me they were glad someone finally stood up to Patricia's tyranny. Several neighbors shared their own horror stories about dealing with her. One family had almost sold their house just to get away from the constant harassment. Marcus, my neighbor to the left, told me that Patricia had been trying to force him out because she had a friend who wanted to buy his house. The violation notices were part of a campaign to make his life miserable. After she was arrested, he found out she had been bad-mouthing his property to potential buyers at open houses in the neighborhood, trying to drive down property values on his street so her friend could get a better deal. Helen, my elderly neighbor to the right, revealed that Patricia had threatened to fine her into foreclosure because Helen had pushed back on some ridiculous violation. Helen's son, who was an attorney, had sent a cease and desist letter, which was probably the only reason Patricia backed off. The entire experience taught me several important lessons. First, document everything. If I had not installed those security cameras, I never would have had the proof I needed. Patricia would have gotten away with denying the fence damage, and I would have been stuck with the bill. The nighttime break-in would have been unsolved. Second, stand up for yourself even when it is difficult. It would have been easier to just pay for the fence and let it go. But that would have encouraged more bad behavior. By fighting back, I not only protected myself but also made the community better for everyone else. Third, sometimes people in positions of minor authority let power go to their heads in dangerous ways. Patricia had convinced herself that she was protecting property values and maintaining community standards. In reality, she was a bully on a power trip who eventually crossed the line into serious criminal behavior. The security footage from that night was the key to everything. Without it, the police would not have had the evidence needed for charges. The county attorney would not have had the leverage for plea deals. The HOA would not have settled with me. Multiple angles showing clear faces, clear actions, and clear intent made the case airtight. I kept all the footage backed up in multiple locations. Parts of it were shown on local news when the story broke. The image of Patricia in her black outfit, holding a sledgehammer, standing on my front porch at 2 a.m. became somewhat iconic. One local station used it as a cautionary tale about HOA disputes getting out of hand. The broader conversation in the community, and even in local government, turned to HOA accountability. There were opinion pieces in the Arizona Republic about the need for better oversight of HOAs. Some state legislators talked about introducing bills to reform HOA regulations, though nothing concrete came of it. The reality is that HOAs have a lot of power and very little oversight in Arizona. For me personally, the experience was exhausting but ultimately vindicating. I had been gaslit for months, told that what I saw was not real, that my evidence was not valid, that I was the problem. Then suddenly, dramatically, the truth came out in the most undeniable way possible. 3 HOA board members were arrested on my front lawn, caught in the act of committing felonies, all captured in high-definition video. My property was fully repaired by late January. I upgraded my security system with additional cameras and better lighting. I also installed a smart doorbell with two-way audio. If anyone from the HOA needed to contact me, they could do it during business hours through proper channels. The HOA did send a new property manager to meet with me in person. Her name was Angela, and she was professional and apologetic. She explained that the management company had been concerned about Patricia's behavior, but had not realized how bad things had gotten. They had recommended several times that she consult with the HOA attorney before taking certain actions, but she had ignored them. Going forward, the management company would have more direct oversight of board decisions. I appreciated the gesture, but I also remained cautious. I kept copies of all correspondence, I recorded phone calls when legally permitted, and I maintained my documentation habits. Trust had been broken, and it would take time to rebuild. The other interesting development was that several of my neighbors asked about my security camera system. I ended up recommending the brand and model to at least a dozen people. Within a few months, there were cameras visible on houses throughout the neighborhood. The new HOA board wisely decided not to enforce the aesthetic violation rules about visible cameras, recognizing that it would be a losing battle and terrible optics after what had happened. Crime in the neighborhood actually decreased noticeably. We had a series of car break-ins in late winter, but several neighbors had footage that helped police identify the suspects. 2 teenagers from a neighboring community were arrested and charged. The presence of cameras everywhere became a deterrent. I also joined the HOA board myself in March. I figured that the best way to ensure reasonable policies was to be involved. Thomas Wu welcomed my participation. At my first meeting, we reviewed and approved a new policy requiring board members to recuse themselves from any decision involving a property they had a dispute with. We also implemented a policy requiring independent contractors to carry liability insurance and requiring photographic documentation before and after any work in common areas adjacent to private property. These seemed like common sense policies, but they had not existed before. The old board had operated with very little structure or accountability. Patricia had essentially run the show, and the other board members had gone along with her either out of fear or apathy. Working on the board gave me insight into just how much damage Patricia had done. We discovered that she had been approving expenditures without proper board votes. She had been giving contracts to friends and family members without competitive bids. She had been using HOA funds to pay for her personal expenses and calling them board business. The HOA's finances were a mess. We had to hire a forensic accountant to sort everything out. The final report showed that Patricia had essentially embezzled about $18,000 over 2 years. The HOA filed a civil suit against her to recover the funds. Given that she was in prison and facing significant restitution obligations, recovery was unlikely. But we filed the suit anyway as a matter of principle and to create a clear record. The forensic audit also revealed that Richard had been awarding vehicle maintenance contracts to his own dealership at inflated prices. The HOA had been paying 15 to 20% more than market rate for work on the maintenance trucks and equipment. We estimated he had overcharged the HOA by about $12,000. We filed a civil suit against him as well. Karen's involvement in the financial issues was less clear. She had signed off on things as secretary, but there was no evidence she had personally benefited. Her attorney argued she had been negligent but not fraudulent. We ultimately decided not to pursue civil action against her, though we did report the issues to the county attorney for potential additional criminal charges. By summer, the neighborhood had settled into a new normal. The new board was functioning well. Violation enforcement was reasonable and fair. Homeowners actually started attending board meetings and participating in decisions. It felt like a real community rather than a dictatorship. I ran into Patricia's husband, Donald, at the grocery store in June. He looked like he had aged 10 years. He told me he was divorcing Patricia and had moved out of the neighborhood. He said he had no idea what she had been planning that night and was horrified when he found out. He apologized to me personally, even though he bore no responsibility. I felt bad for him. His life had been destroyed by his wife's actions. I also learned that Patricia's real estate career had been struggling before all this happened. She had been under investigation by the state real estate board for some questionable practices. The arrest and conviction ended any chance of her salvaging her career. Her broker had dropped her immediately, and her pending sales had all fallen through. She lost her house to foreclosure and her husband left. By the time she got out of prison, she would have nothing. Part of me felt satisfaction at her downfall. She had been cruel and vindictive, and she had gotten what she deserved. But another part of me just felt sad. She had thrown away her entire life because she could not admit she was wrong about a fence. If she had just acknowledged the drainage problem back in September and agreed to fix it, none of this would have happened. Instead, her pride and need for control had led her down a path that ended with a prison sentence and complete ruin. Richard's car dealership closed in August. The negative publicity and his conviction made it impossible to continue operating. He owed money to creditors and faced multiple lawsuits from customers claiming he had defrauded them over the years. It turned out the HOA was not the only place where he had been cutting corners and overcharging. His arrest had opened a can of worms that destroyed everything he had built. Karen got out on parole in December after serving 9 months. She left Arizona and moved to Oregon to live with her daughter. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she was working as a cashier at a grocery store and living in a small apartment. Her teacher's pension had been reduced due to her conviction, and she was struggling financially. She had lost her husband, who had died of a heart attack while she was in prison, and most of her friends had abandoned her. As for me, I continued living in my house and serving on the HOA board. By the end of the year, I was elected vice president. Thomas Wu and I worked well together, and we had restored trust in the HOA among the homeowners. Dues were paid on time, violations were handled fairly, and the neighborhood looked better than it had in years. I also started a blog about HOA issues, sharing my story and offering advice to others dealing with difficult associations. It gained a decent following. I heard from people all over the country with their own nightmare HOA stories. Some were worse than mine. Some were not as bad, but all shared common themes: abuse of power, lack of accountability, and homeowners feeling trapped and helpless. I used my blog to advocate for HOA reform at the state level. I testified before a legislative committee in February of the following year, sharing my experience and calling for better oversight and clearer homeowner rights. The committee was receptive, and a bill was introduced that would create an ombudsman office for HOA disputes and establish penalties for board members who abused their positions. The bill faced opposition from property management companies and some HOA industry groups who argued it was unnecessary and would be too costly. But it had strong support from homeowner advocacy groups. The bill passed the House and was pending in the Senate as of the end of the legislative session. It was not a sure thing, but there was momentum for change. Looking back on everything that happened, I sometimes could not believe it was real. The whole situation felt like something from a movie. An HOA president and 2 board members arrested for attempting to burn down a homeowner's house because of a lawsuit over a fence. It was absurd, but it had happened, and I had the scars, both emotional and financial, to prove it. The total cost to me, even after the settlement and insurance, was probably close to $15,000. I had paid attorney fees before the settlement kicked in. I had paid my insurance deductible. I had lost time from work dealing with everything. I had paid for security system upgrades. I had paid for repairs to items not covered by insurance, like landscaping damaged when the fire department ventilated my house. But I had also gained something valuable. I had gained confidence in standing up for myself. I had gained knowledge about my rights and how to enforce them. I had gained respect in my community, and I had gained a purpose in trying to help others avoid what I went through. The security footage remained the centerpiece of everything. I still had every frame stored and backed up. It had been subpoenaed for the criminal cases and the civil suits. It had been shown to insurance adjusters, attorneys, judges, and juries. It had been featured on news broadcasts and shared online. That footage was the unimpeachable truth that no amount of lies could overcome. I thought about what would have happened without those cameras. Patricia would have denied damaging my fence, just like she did. But without proof, it would have been her word against mine. My lawsuit would have been much harder to win. The settlement would have been smaller or non-existent. And on that night in December, they would have broken into my house, poured gasoline, and possibly set it on fire. Without video evidence, the investigation would have been much harder. They might have gotten away with it. The cameras saved my house and possibly my life. If I had been home that night instead of in Denver, things could have gone very differently. If they had been surprised to find me there, who knows what would have happened? Patricia was wielding a sledgehammer. Richard had a crowbar. Karen had gasoline. That was a recipe for tragedy. The police detective told me later that he believed they would have set the fire if they had gotten the chance. The plan, as he reconstructed it from text messages and interviews, was to break in, pour gasoline throughout my house, set it on fire and leave. They expected I was in Denver and would not know until it was too late. They thought the security cameras would be destroyed in the fire, eliminating the evidence. They thought they would get away with it, and it would look like faulty wiring or an accident. The flaw in their plan was that my cameras backed up to cloud storage in real time. Even if my house had burned down and the cameras were destroyed, the footage would still exist. They apparently did not know or consider that. Patricia was not as tech-savvy as she thought she was. The whole experience reinforced my belief in the importance of evidence and documentation. In any dispute, especially with someone in authority, you need proof. Witnesses can forget or lie. Documents can be disputed. But video footage is hard to argue with. When you have clear, time-stamped, high-quality video showing exactly what happened, the truth becomes undeniable. I recommended to everyone I talked to that they should have security cameras if possible. The cost had come down significantly in recent years. For a few $100s, you could get a decent system. For $1,000 or $2,000, you could get excellent coverage with cloud backup and mobile access. It was a worthwhile investment for peace of mind and protection. The neighborhood's transformation over that year was remarkable. We went from a place where people were afraid of their own HOA to a place where the HOA actually served the community. Volunteer participation increased. People started organizing neighborhood events again. Kids played outside without parents worrying about violation notices for toys left in the yard. We even established a community garden in one of the common areas. That never would have happened under Patricia's reign. She would have rejected it as unsightly or too difficult to maintain. But Thomas and I championed it, and it became a popular gathering place. Neighbors who had never spoken to each other were now gardening together and sharing vegetables. Property values in Willow Creek Estates actually increased despite all the negative publicity. Potential buyers saw the news stories and were concerned at first. But when they learned that the problem board members were gone and reforms had been implemented, they saw it as a positive. They knew they were buying into a community that had learned from its mistakes and had strong oversight now. I sold my house 2 years later, but not because of the HOA drama. I got a job opportunity in Colorado that was too good to pass up. When I listed the house, I was upfront with potential buyers about everything that had happened. I showed them the security footage, the news articles, and the reforms that had been implemented. Rather than being scared off, most buyers were impressed by the transparency and the community's response. The house sold in 3 days for $15,000 over asking price. Multiple buyers got into a bidding war. I made a solid profit despite all the headaches. The new owners were a young couple with a baby. I gave them detailed instructions on the security system and recommended they keep it active. I also introduced them to Thomas and the other board members. Before I left, the HOA board held a small appreciation event for me. They presented me with a plaque recognizing my service and my role in transforming the community. Thomas gave a speech talking about how my willingness to stand up to injustice had saved the neighborhood. It was touching and made all the struggle feel worthwhile. Patricia was still in prison when I moved. She had been denied parole at her first hearing. The parole board cited her lack of remorse and her continued insistence that she had done nothing wrong. She had apparently blamed me in her parole hearing, saying I was vindictive and had provoked her. The board was not sympathetic. She would have to serve at least another year before being eligible for parole again. Richard was also still incarcerated. He had been caught trying to operate business affairs from prison in violation of parole conditions, and his release date had been pushed back. Karen was the only one who had gotten out, and by all accounts, she was struggling to rebuild any semblance of a normal life. The civil suits for financial recovery were still pending when I left Arizona. The HOA had obtained judgments against both Patricia and Richard, but collection was difficult. Patricia had no assets left. Richard's assets were tied up in bankruptcy proceedings. The HOA would likely recover pennies on the dollar, if anything, but the principle mattered more than the money. The community had sent a message that corruption and abuse would not be tolerated. Future board members would think twice before misusing their positions. Homeowners would be more vigilant and more willing to push back against overreach. As I drove away from Scottsdale for the last time, heading to my new life in Colorado, I reflected on the whole experience. It had been stressful, expensive, and at times frightening. But it had also been empowering and educational. I had learned that standing up for yourself matters. I had learned that documentation and evidence are crucial. I had learned that most people are good and will support you if you are in the right. I had also learned that a small amount of power could corrupt people in unexpected ways. Patricia, Richard, and Karen were not career criminals. They were middle-aged suburbanites with decent lives, but they had let their positions on an HOA board go to their heads. They had convinced themselves that they were above the rules and that they could get away with anything. The security cameras had proven them wrong. The footage of them on my property in the middle of the night with weapons and gasoline was their downfall. They had conspired to commit serious crimes, and the evidence was irrefutable. The criminal justice system had held them accountable. They were paying the price for their actions. My story became something of a cautionary tale in HOA communities across Arizona and beyond. Property management companies used it in training for new board members. Attorney firms specializing in HOA law cited it in seminars. Homeowner advocacy groups shared it to illustrate the importance of knowing your rights and documenting everything. I occasionally still received emails through my blog from people dealing with their own HOA nightmares. I tried to respond to as many as I could, offering advice and encouragement. I could not fight every battle, but I could help people understand their options and give them confidence to stand up for themselves. The legislative reform efforts in Arizona eventually paid off. The bill creating an HOA ombudsman office passed in a modified form 18 months after I testified. It was not everything advocates had hoped for, but it was a step in the right direction. There was now a formal process for homeowners to file complaints and get independent review of HOA actions. Board members who violated their fiduciary duties could face sanctions. I like to think that my case had played a small role in making that happen. By going public with my story and by testifying before the legislature, I had put a human face on the problem of HOA abuse. Lawmakers could not ignore the reality of what had happened when they had video evidence and criminal convictions to look at. In Colorado, I made sure to buy a house that was not part of an HOA. I had learned my lesson. I would rather deal with a neighbor who did not maintain their lawn than deal with another Patricia Hendricks. The freedom to do what I wanted with my own property, within reasonable local ordinances, was worth more than any aesthetic consistency an HOA might provide. I still kept in touch with Thomas and a few other friends from Willow Creek Estates. Thomas sent me updates on how the community was doing. By all accounts, it was thriving. The HOA was functional and fair. The neighborhood was peaceful. People were happy. It was everything an HOA should be, but too often was not. The security camera footage that started everything remained on my backup drives. I had promised the prosecutor I would keep it available in case there were any appeals or additional legal proceedings. Patricia's attorney had filed an appeal of her conviction, arguing that the search of her phone for text messages violated her rights. The appeal was ultimately denied, but it took almost 2 years to resolve. When I thought about that footage now, I thought about how much had hinged on a decision I made almost impulsively. I had installed those cameras because I was frustrated with Patricia's constant violation notices and wanted documentation. I had no idea they would end up capturing attempted arson and leading to the arrest and imprisonment of 3 people. It made me think about how many other HOA disputes were happening across the country, where homeowners did not have the evidence they needed. How many people were being bullied, fined unfairly, or even having their property damaged without recourse because they could not prove what happened. My situation had worked out because I had the footage. Others were not so lucky. That was why I continued to advocate for HOA reform and for homeowners to protect themselves. The power imbalance between an HOA board and an individual homeowner was significant. The board had the association's money, the management company's resources, and legal counsel at their disposal. The homeowner had themselves and whatever they could afford. Leveling the playing field required evidence, knowledge, and persistence. My security system had been the great equalizer. It had turned, he said, she said, dispute into an open and shut case. It had protected my property and quite possibly my life. And it had brought justice in a situation where justice might otherwise have been impossible to achieve. The story of HOA board members being arrested for conspiracy to commit arson against a homeowner was shocking enough to make national news briefly. I did a few interviews with media outlets, always emphasizing the importance of documentation and the need for HOA accountability. The story resonated because many people had their own negative HOA experiences, even if not as dramatic as mine. Some critics argued that my case was an extreme outlier and that most HOAs functioned fine. That was probably true. Most HOA boards were made up of well-intentioned volunteers trying to maintain their communities. Most disputes were minor and resolved amicably. But the fact that extreme cases like mine could happen at all pointed to systemic issues with how HOAs were structured and overseen. The lack of meaningful oversight, the concentration of power in small boards, the difficulty and expense of challenging HOA decisions, and the perverse incentives created by fines and legal fees all contributed to an environment where abuse could flourish. Patricia had operated with essentially no checks on her power for years before I challenged her. Who knows how many other homeowners she had bullied into submission before I pushed back. The reforms in Arizona and similar efforts in other states were addressing some of these issues. But change was slow and met resistance from entrenched interests. Property management companies made money from conflict. Attorneys made money from litigation. Some board members enjoyed the power and did not want to give it up. Changing the system required sustained pressure from homeowners and legislators willing to take on those interests. I remained committed to being part of that pressure. Even from Colorado, I stayed involved in HOA reform advocacy. I shared my story whenever I had the opportunity. I supported legislation in other states modeled on Arizona's reforms. I contributed to legal defense funds for homeowners fighting abusive HOAs. It was a small way to pay forward the support I had received. The final legal chapter in my case closed almost 3 years after that night in December, when Patricia and her co-conspirators were arrested on my lawn. All appeals had been exhausted. All civil suits had been settled or dismissed. Patricia remained in prison with about 6 months left to serve. Richard had been released on parole and was working as a mechanic, a far cry from his former life as a dealership owner. Karen was still in Oregon, estranged from most of her family and former friends. The HOA in Willow Creek Estates was stable and well run. Thomas had stepped down as president after 4 years of service, and a new generation of leadership had taken over. They maintained the reforms he and I had implemented and continued to prioritize transparency and fairness. The neighborhood was regularly cited as one of the best places to live in Scottsdale. As for me, I had moved on but never forgotten. The experience had changed me in fundamental ways. I was more cautious about trusting authority. I was more vigilant about protecting my rights. I was more willing to fight when fighting was necessary. And I was more committed to helping others who found themselves in similar situations. The security footage that captured everything remained the most powerful reminder of how quickly situations could escalate and how important evidence was. Those few minutes of video had altered the course of multiple lives. They had sent 3 people to prison, cost them their careers and reputations, and transformed a neighborhood. They had vindicated my claims and exposed a conspiracy. They had been the difference between justice and injustice. I sometimes wondered what Patricia thought about in her prison cell. Did she regret her actions? Did she understand how her inability to admit a simple mistake about fence damage had led to her complete destruction? Did she blame me, or did she take any responsibility for her choices? I would never know. I had no desire to contact her or hear from her. That chapter of my life was closed, but the lessons remained. Stand up for yourself. Document everything. Know your rights. Do not let anyone bully you into submission. And sometimes, when you shine a light on wrongdoing, the results can be more dramatic than you ever imagined. My security cameras had gotten an HOA board arrested for conspiracy. It sounded like the plot of a movie, but it was my reality. And I was grateful for the cameras, the evidence, and the justice that followed.